The Latin adjective super means above, over, beyond. Someone with superpowers has more powers, has powers extra than the average human being. Superman is beyond, above other men. And it's interesting that the sense of literally being on top of, above, is conserved in the modern Spanish preposition that descends from Latin super, sobre. I could still talk in modern Spanish about leaving a book sobre la mesa, on top of the table. But how did we move from super to Spanish sobre? Well, in today's video, I want to trace the history of Latin super into the modern Romance languages in 3 simple steps. There are some important disclaimers here. While I will try include as much data as possible, for convenience's sake, I'm going to focus on the 4 Romance languages I feel most comfortable with. So what this means is we will be tracing the transition from Latin super into its descendants in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian. I will include other languages along the way, but bear in mind that I have to be somewhat selective for the purposes of this video. The second disclaimer that I want to include here is that we will be using Portuguese sobre and Spanish sobre as the benchmarks for this history. And the reasons for that will become clear when we arrive at the second and third steps. But let's start with the very first step, with the Latin super. It's a simple word, 2 syllables with 2 vowels, u and e. And as you may have heard, either from this channel or from other resources that cover Latin online, Latin made a phonemic distinction between vowel length. So that is to say, every one of the 5 vowels, a, e, I, o, u, had a short and a long version. This means that there were 2 kind of u vowels, technically called close back vowels. There was u short and u long. And philologists assure us that that short u was increasingly being pronounced as o as we arrive towards late antiquity and even during the classical imperial era under Augustus itself, perhaps. But what we know for certain is that the famous Appendix Probi, almost certainly erroneously attributed to Marcus Valerius Probus, complains that Latin speakers are saying columna instead of columna. We see there that that short u has been changed into an o. I believe that this occurred in non-formal literary forms of Latin in both stressed and unstressed environments, but you might be able to correct me there. I wasn't able to find any clear indication one way or another from the scholarship I consulted for this video. So let me know if there was actually a distinction in this vowel quality change depending on whether this short u found itself in stressed or unstressed environments. Nonetheless, what we can know is that because this transition from the short Latin u to the front mid-closed vowel o occurred quite early, still during the imperial age, it occurred early enough to affect all the Romance languages. If we look at all the modern forms of the Latin adjective super, we can see that they almost all have an o. The Spanish has sobre, Portuguese has sobra. Other Ibero-Romance languages like Astur-Leonese has sobre, Galician has sobre, and even beyond the Iberian Peninsula, its modern Italian has sopra. We might hypothesize here and say that at this stage, if we control all other changes and just change the vowel quality, an early version of all of these Romance languages might have pronounced the Latin super as something like soper. If you have any attestation for that, please let me know in the comments below. I struggle often to find attestation in late Latin and early Romance for obvious reasons. People didn't tend to write down what were considered erroneous forms. The surprising exceptions to this change, however, can be found in modern French, where super has become sur. If you speak Romanian, your ears might have pricked up at this step because you'll know that Romanian still has asupra, and Sardinian, notable for its phonological conservatism, still has subra or supra. It's very interesting that these Romance languages seem to have escaped this pretty early vowel quality change. Before moving on to step 2, I might provide another historical disclaimer and indicate that Old French, had a form sobre, which didn't pass on to Middle French. So we at least have there attested that one of the options in Old French was to pronounce Latin super with a form that had actually changed the vowel quality from u to o, corresponding with the norm across the other Romance languages. Why that form didn't pass on into Middle French or later forms of French, I cannot say, but perhaps you might know. So much for step one. Let's move to step two. And step two affects principally Ibero-Romance, perhaps only Ibero-Romance, certainly as far as I could tell, and that is the voicing of intervocalic consonants. Now, we've made a video about this before, so check that out if you want to dive a little bit deeper into this. But if I may simplify it, Spanish and Portuguese and the other Ibero-Romance languages had this tendency to take unvoiced consonants that were between vowels and voice them. Voicing describes the process of pronouncing a sound, vibrating your vocal cords. This would be the difference between, say, p and b. If you put your hand on your vocal cord, you can see that there's an enormous difference between those two. You could try this also with s and z. It's the same difference between k and g and t and d. This is why, for example, Latin totus becomes todo in Spanish, why Latin lupus becomes lobo in Portuguese. And I'm certain that it's probably the same case with other Ibero-Romance languages like Galician or Astur-Leonese. If we can pin the first phonological change, the movement from u to o to late antiquity, we can also, with relative accuracy, pin this second change, the change in vocalization, to approximately the 10th century. We know this because in manuscripts from this time, we see the Latin titulus, which had recently been reintroduced as a cultismo, a learned word, was being pronounced and even spelt as tidulus. With all of that out of the way, let's evaluate how this would have changed super in some of the Romance languages. We will have already moved from super to soper. Now we will voice that plosive p into a bilabial voiced plosive b in the Iberian Romance languages. So in Spanish and Portuguese, we will move from soper to something like soper. Interestingly enough, our Italian sopra retains the unvoiced plosive, as do the Sardinian and Romanian versions of this Latin word. The French sur seems to have eliminated the plosive altogether. It's difficult to find clear chronological attestation for this because already by Middle French, the modern form sur was already evident. So French seems to change and diverge pretty early on. And now we move on to the third step, which is the swapping of the final two letters, the final two sounds, the rhotic r and the vowel e. If in initial Latin we had super, e, then r, notice that almost all of the modern Romance varieties end in a vowel and anticipate that rhotic sound. This is a process called metathesis, in which sounds swap places. Spanish does this quite a lot. Notice that the Latin miracula becomes milagro in Spanish. The R and the L completely swap places. Parabola in Latin becomes palabra in Spanish. This is where we find that using Ibero-Romance as a standard of measurement for this little history of ours is crucial because it sequences the changes nicely. Remember that I mentioned that Ibero-Romance voices intervocalic consonants? Well, that obviously means that the consonant p had to be between vowels when it became b. And that couldn't have been the case if the metathesis occurred before the vocalization. So we can be pretty certain that the three changes chronologically go from changing the vowel quality u to o, then vocalizing p to b in some forms, and finally the metathesis of the rhotic and the vowel. Once again, if we quickly consult our list here, comparing all the different Romance forms, we can see that this is a pattern. Almost all of them undergo metathesis, even those who haven't undergone vocalization or the initial vowel quality shift. It's particularly interesting in this story how, in a weird sense, conservative French is. Yes, certainly it seems to have completely elided the consonant in the middle of this word, but the beginning and the end remain exactly the same. In modern French, su. Well, I hope you enjoyed that quick dive into what the history of a very simple Latin adjective can show us about Romance language historical phonology. But if I left out your language's version of super, let me know in the comments below, and I'd be extremely grateful if you could trace the history of changes in that word. As always, if you've noticed any slip-ups or any mistakes, let me please know in the comments below, and I will amend my ways. But for now, I want to say thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Valete omnes.